So in this video, I want to show you 3 really helpful exercises that you can do today that will instantly improve the amount of hip internal rotation that you have at your disposal. And hip internal rotation is really important for a number of reasons, but for anyone who isn't aware, hip internal rotation is obviously the ability to rotate your leg or your hip inwards towards the midline. With your leg straight, it looks like this. But the confusing thing for a lot of people is that when you bend your knee, hip internal rotation is essentially allowing your foot to rotate outwards while that knee is bent. And further to this, it's really important to understand that a lack of hip internal rotation can have serious long-term consequences for the mechanical loading of your knee, your hip obviously, and your lower back. And the reason for that is clearly that that hip is basically stuck in between your knee and your lower back. So any restrictions in that area can have a mechanical flow on to the tissues above and below that area. So it goes without saying, it's really important to not only have some strategies to understand whether you're lacking some of that hip internal rotation, but some effective exercises that you can do to immediately improve that hip internal rotation, just so that you can say that you have a normal functioning hip joint. So getting into some quick assessment techniques, a very simple way to see how much internal rotation that you have at your hip is to lie down on your back. And it's great to have someone do this with you, but if you bend your hip to about 90 degrees and just try and rotate that lower leg, that foot out as far as you feel comfortable without feeling like your knee's moving around, lock your thigh in, rotate that hip out as far as you feel comfortable. Clinically, if you can get to about 30 degrees, we're pretty comfortable that your hip is functioning normally from an internal rotation perspective. It's also great to do that because as we do each of these exercises, you can come back to that assessment to see how it makes you feel. And then a second assessment technique that you can do, this one is a little bit more advanced, it's a little bit more brutal on your hips and knees. So as soon as I do this, you probably know straight away whether this is a technique or a test that's for you. But this is a position that you should be able to get into. I haven't done this for a while, so I'm interested to see how I go doing this. And that's basically the W sit, where you see a lot of our children can get into this position where you're on your knees, you have your feet turned out, and then basically you can sit down onto your heels and get your bottom to touch the ground. So for me, I can get my bottom to touch the ground here, but I feel a lot of tension on my knees. So I have to lean back a little bit just to take the tension off those knees. But what's really interesting with this is I'm taking note of how this feels to do at the moment, so that when we do these 3 different exercises, I'm gonna do this one specifically for me, just to see how much easier, more hip internal rotation at my hip feels, and what that does to relieve some of the pressure on my knees in this position. So getting into the first exercise, which is the hip joint capsule stretch. There's a few different ways you can do this, but the one we're going to focus on specifically is being down on your hands and knees. And there is a variation of this that you can try if you find getting down here is too hard for you. But essentially what we want to get you to do is we want to get you onto your hands and knees. We're going to internally rotate your hip. So when your hip is bent to 90 degrees, it looks like your foot's coming outwards, which can be confusing. That's internally rotating the hip as far as you feel comfortable. Dig your feet into the ground there just to provide some traction. With your opposite leg, we're taking the opposite leg back. What we're trying to imagine and envisage here is imagine that your thigh bone is going to be pushing out sort of the back side of your hip. You shouldn't feel anything in your groin when you do this or at the front of your hip. If you do, it probably means that you've dropped too far into that hip flex position. You might have to come more into a 90-degree shape, but we want you to explore the depths of how deep you can go here, because the exercise itself is essentially keeping your shoulders and hips connected. We're going to get you to shift your body weight across towards the side that you're stretching. You may need to shift your hands across to find a better base of support. Again, we're not getting you to shift your hips down. We're trying to keep you sort of level with the ground, horizontally coming across until you find a really nice stretch or a pressure at the side of your hip, potentially towards the back a little bit as well. And then again, you can be as deep as you want to here, but find the best version of this stretch for you. We want to get you to hang out here for 30 seconds, 60 seconds, a minute, whatever you feel it takes to feel some change or some relaxation happen through this tissue. Now, this is obviously going to capture some of the soft tissue over the top. The idea is it is more fundamentally a hip internal rotated capsular stretch. It's going to bias that part of the capsule that might be stiff. And if you do feel like it starts to give a little bit, you can go further across into the stretch. We can drop down further into the stretch to chase that sort of feeling of pressure. And then again, once you've done that, If you can recheck whatever movement you feel was important to you previously, whether it be on your back, internally rotating the hip, or something like a W sit. For me, straight away, I don't have anywhere near the same pressure through my knee because I've introduced more range of motion through my hip, so my knee's not having to do as much here. There's still a little bit of tension there. My right side still feels the same, obviously, because I didn't do that, but I feel like I can get down on that left side a little bit easier than what I could before. So then as we move a little bit more superficially out from the hip, more towards some of the soft tissue over the top, and a great way to do this that I found is that if you can lie on your back, and if you can take the side that you want to stretch, take that foot out to the side a little bit, because what I'm going to get you to do here is I'm going to get you to internally rotate your hip without feeling like your hip itself or your back lifts up off the ground. So keeping your butt cheeks on the ground, we want you to drop that down as far as you feel comfortable. And again, you might find there's some tightness through the front of the hip or even out to the side a little bit, whether it's your hip flexor, whether it's your TFL muscle, whether it's one of your gluteal muscles as well, it doesn't matter. We're not specifically trying to stretch one muscle here. We're trying to improve a range of motion or a movement. So anything that's restricted or restricting you in this moment, we're going to capture with this stretch. So once you've found a position or you found your level, you've come out far enough and you've dropped that knee down without feeling like your hip or your bottom's coming off the ground. Once you've found that, we want you to squeeze all of that tissue. So squeeze your butt cheek, tense your thigh up. Imagine that you're going to do a bridge without actually bridging up off the ground. Hold that for 5 seconds. What should happen is by tensing this up, it gets your brain involved. And then when you relax that tension without losing the position, that tissue should give a little bit. So you might find that you can drop down a little bit further than you could before. I feel like my leg's going a little bit further this time. Again, we want to repeat that process. Give it a squeeze wherever it feels tight. Squeeze your butt cheek, squeeze your thigh, tense the area that feels particularly tight and restricted. Once you've finished doing that, relax. Again, you should find it can drop a little bit deeper and keep repeating that process until you feel like you've stopped making change or you've potentially had enough. And then again, coming back to this same position again, straight away, I can get down to this position now. I don't feel like I need to have my hands there. The amount of tension on my right leg is the same, obviously, but now I feel like I've got a lot more range of motion to work with. My glute on this side is sitting down a little bit lower on the ground now. Doesn't feel as tight here. Obviously, this one isn't any different, but this one's improved enough that I can now sort of play around in this position a little bit more than what I could before. So again, this now takes us to the last exercise of these three, where we've tried to address some of the deep capsular restriction. We've also tried to capture any of the muscular tightness that might be over the top. And now we can really hone into specific areas that might be restricting our ability to internally rotate that hip, whether it's TFL, whether it's quad, whether it's hip flexor, glute, it doesn't really matter. We want to go hunting for whatever that might be and respectfully try and improve that really, really quickly. So what I'd like you to do is the side that you're working on, I'll get you to lie down on that side and gently place the ball into the side of your hip. So what we want to do basically is we want to look for anything that feels tight. It may feel tender through here. It can be quite ugly for a lot of people. So you've got two different options here. We can do it with your legs straight and find some of that tissue in this position. I'm trying to pin down some of that tightness and then twist our leg in a way that shears free some of that tightness and encourages that tissue to release or to free up in whatever way that it needs to allow us to internally rotate that hip a little bit more. This one might feel a little bit awkward, specifically if you're tight and you find it hard to rotate that leg and turning that foot up. The next version of this is if you bend your leg up a little bit more, the next thing I want to get you to do is keeping pressure on that spot, keeping your heel on the ground. We can very gently lift that knee off the ground, encourage that internal rotation at the hip to shear free that tissue. Again, if you find that either of these positions that you're in are awkward to internally rotate that hip, it's completely fine just to find a spot, let that ball press in there, encourage that tissue to give. I will get you to squeeze that tightness if you can. Hold it for 5 seconds. Again, it gets your brain involved so that once you stop tensing it, it should give a little bit. It might feel a little bit less tender. And you can find where in your leg, and that's a tight spot for me, feels particularly tender and uncomfortable. Give it a squeeze, make it work, tense the muscle up that you're pressing into, tense the tissue up, hold it for a couple of seconds. When you relax, it should relax and it should get a little bit easier. So again, you can hunt around that sort of front outside corner of the hip for clues as to what might be restricting that internal rotation of the hip. And then again, coming down again, it now just feels comfortable. So the right side feels the same, still a bit tender through the knee. This side for me, there's no knee tenderness anymore. I feel like I'm dropping down a little bit easier on that side. whereas I need to work on this side a little bit more just to bring this back up to speed. But the point of this basically is to show you that those 3 exercises should give you an instant boost to the amount of hip internal rotation range that you have. If you're someone that deals with any knee pain at all, if you have any hip dysfunction, groin dysfunction, or you're dealing with some lower back dysfunction as well, hip internal rotation tends to be one that a lot of people tend to lose. So let me know in the comments down below which one of those exercises you found the most helpful. But I genuinely hope those 3 exercises were helpful for you to improve that hip internal rotation. If it was, please consider leaving a like rating on the video, subscribe to the channel if you're new. Please consider leaving a super thanks donation if you want to support me and the channel, just to allow me to keep making these types of videos. But again, with that being said, as always, I appreciate you watching. I genuinely and sincerely hope that that was helpful for you, and I'll hopefully see you next time. Bye.